The man who called himself Jacob Thorne was a monument to grief, carved from the granite of the high plains and weathered by a silence as vast as the sky. His ranch was a reflection of his soul, orderly in its fences and its stock, but hollow at its core. The wind that scoured the land found no warmth in the windows of his house, only its own lonely reflection. Inside, dust settled like a fine grey shroud over the memory of a life that had ended 2 winters past. And in the center of this cold, quiet world was his daughter, a small, 6-year-old ghost named Lily. She was the living heart of his failure, a child whose sorrow was so profound it had a scent, a sad, unwashed smell of neglect, of a father too lost in his own darkness to notice the grime on her dress or the tangles in her sun-bleached hair. The children in the dusty town, with the cruel, simple honesty of the young, called her Thorne's weed and held their noses when she passed. Jacob saw their cruelty but did not know how to stop it, for he knew it was his fault. His hands, capable of breaking a horse or mending a split rail, were clumsy and useless when it came to the delicate work of a child's hair or a mother's touch. So he did the only thing a man like him knew how to do: he made a transaction. He sent a letter to a woman in a town 3 states away, a woman he had never met, whose reply was as sparse and practical as his own offer. He offered a room, board, and a wage. He was hiring a housekeeper. What arrived on the stagecoach was a woman named Annalise, who carried a single carpet bag and a quietness that rivaled his own. She was not what he had expected. There was a stillness in her grey eyes, a history he could not read but felt in the careful way she held herself, as if bracing against a phantom blow. He paid for a housekeeper, but he received a woman who looked at the dust-caked windows and the forlorn child not with judgment, but with a deep, weary understanding. Their first exchange was one of pure function. "The well is there," he said, pointing. "The girl's room is upstairs. Supplies are in the pantry." Annalise simply nodded, her gaze sweeping over the cold hearth, the unwashed dishes, the small, smudged face of the little girl peering from behind a doorway. She did not offer pleasantries or ask questions. She simply untied the ribbons of her bonnet, rolled up her sleeves, and began the slow, arduous work of bringing a house and a home back from the dead. Annalise began not with words, but with water. For 3 days, the sound of her work was the only disturbance to the ranch's oppressive silence. It was the slosh of water in a bucket, the rhythmic scrape of a brush against floorboards, the snap of clean linens in the relentless wind. She moved through the house like a gentle tide, receding the layers of dust and sorrow. The first thing to change was the air itself. The stale scent of disuse was slowly replaced by the sharp, clean smell of lye soap and the faint, earthy aroma of dried lavender she unpacked from a small sachet in her bag. Jacob watched her from a distance, his posture rigid, his face an unreadable mask. He had expected a servant, someone to perform chores. He had not anticipated this quiet, methodical reclamation of his space. She never spoke to him unless necessary, her voice low and even, asking only where to find more rags or if he preferred his coffee black. He would answer in grunts or single words, feeling an unfamiliar intrusion in his self-imposed exile. He was a man accustomed to the predictable rhythms of livestock and seasons, but this woman's silent industry was a force of nature he had not accounted for. She mended Lily's torn dress with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She polished the clouded glass of the oil lamps until they shone. She baked bread, and the warm, yeasty smell filled the kitchen, a scent so deeply tied to the life he had lost that it was a physical pain in his chest. He saw Lily watching the woman, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. The child, who had learned to be as silent and unobtrusive as a shadow, was drawn to the gentle hum of Annalise's presence. The woman did not force an introduction, she simply existed, a steady, warm presence in the cold corners of their lives. She was washing the memory of his wife from the house, and he did not know if he should be grateful or furious. The house was becoming brighter, cleaner, but it felt like a betrayal. Yet, when he saw Lily take a hesitant step toward the kitchen, drawn by the scent of baking, he felt something else stir within him, something that had been frozen for 2 long years, a flicker of hope so faint it was almost indistinguishable from the pain. The true transformation began not with the house, but with the child. For days, Annalise had cleaned around Lily, her movements gentle, her presence a silent offering of peace. She never addressed the girl's unkempt state directly, never showed a hint of the revulsion Lily was so used to seeing in the faces of others. She simply created an environment of clean, quiet order, a stark contrast to the child herself. Then, on the fourth day, as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the newly scrubbed porch, Annalise approached the girl. Lily flinched, expecting a reprimand, a harsh hand. Instead, Annalise knelt, her eyes level with the child's. "I brought something up from the creek," she said, her voice as soft as creek water over smooth stones. She held out her hand. In her palm lay a sprig of wild mint and a pale, lacy blossom of yarrow. Lily stared, mesmerized. No one had offered her a flower before. "They smell like sunshine," Annalise whispered. "I thought we could put them in your bath." She did not say, "You need a bath. You smell." She said, "We." An act of shared purpose, not of correction. Later, in the warm kitchen, a large copper tub steamed with water heated on the stove. Annalise crumbled the herbs into the water, and a fragrant, clean scent rose to fill the room, chasing away the last vestiges of staleness. Jacob stood in the shadows of the barn, watching through the kitchen window, his heart a tight, painful knot in his chest. He saw Annalise gently unbutton Lily's grimy dress. He saw the child's thin shoulders, the visible map of her ribs. He saw her hesitate, then step into the water, a gasp of warmth escaping her lips. He watched as Annalise took a soft cloth and, with a tenderness that felt sacred, began to wash his daughter. She washed the dust from her skin, the grime from beneath her fingernails, the sorrow from her tangled hair. She worked with a reverent patience, her hands communicating a language of care that Jacob had long forgotten. As she rinsed Lily's hair, the water running brown, it felt to Jacob like a baptism, a washing away of his own profound neglect. When it was done, Annalise wrapped the child in a thick, worn blanket that she had aired in the sun all day. Lily, clean for the first time in memory, her skin pink and smelling of mint and yarrow, leaned her head against Annalise's shoulder and closed her eyes. It was a gesture of absolute trust, a surrender. From the darkness of the barn, Jacob Thorne finally let out the breath he had been holding for 2 years, and it came out as a ragged, silent sob. In the weeks that followed, a fragile routine began to form, weaving the three of them into a semblance of a family. The house was no longer silent, it was quiet. There was a difference. The silence had been an absence, a void. The quiet was a presence, a space filled with the soft sounds of life, the snip of Annalise's scissors as she mended, the whisper of a broom on the floor, the small, humming songs Lily now sang to herself as she played with a set of wooden blocks Annalise had found and cleaned. Lily, once a ghost in her own home, was its new center of gravity. She followed Annalise everywhere, a clean, bright shadow. Her hair, now brushed daily and tied with a simple ribbon, shone like spun gold in the lamplight. She began to speak more, her voice still hesitant, but losing its fearful edge. The change in the child was a constant, unspoken testament to the woman's influence. Jacob found himself watching them, his work on the ranch punctuated by long moments of observation. He saw Annalise teaching Lily how to knead dough, her small hands covered in flour. He saw them sitting on the porch steps, Annalise pointing out the constellations in the vast, dark sky. He felt a deep, aching gratitude that was so foreign and overwhelming he had no words for it. One evening, the air was still and cool, carrying the scent of distant rain. Jacob was cleaning a rifle on the porch, the metallic clicks of the mechanism sharp in the twilight. Inside, Annalise sat by the fire, her needle flashing as she patched one of his work shirts. Lily was on the floor beside her, drawing on a piece of slate with a nub of chalk. For a long while, the only sounds were the fire, the needle, and the chalk. Then, Lily held up her drawing. It was a child's simple rendering, 3 figures. A tall one, a small one, and one in between. They were all holding hands beneath a crudely drawn sun with beaming rays. Lily pointed a small, chalky finger at the middle figure, the one with a triangle dress. She looked up at Annalise, her blue eyes wide and serious in the firelight. "Are you staying?" she asked. The question was so simple, so direct, it cut through all the unspoken arrangements and practicalities. It landed in the quiet room with the weight of a stone. On the porch, Jacob's hands froze. The rifle felt heavy and cold in his grip. The child's question was not for Anneliese alone, it was for him. It was a question about the future, about permanence, about whether this fragile piece they had found was something they could keep. Anneliese stopped sewing. She looked from the drawing to the child's earnest face, and then her gaze drifted toward the darkened doorway, as if she could feel Jacob listening. The fire crackled, eating the silence, and for the first time, the quiet in the house felt heavy again, burdened by a question that no one was ready to answer. The answer came not in words, but in the fury of the sky. Autumn bled into an early, brutal winter, and a blizzard descended upon the plains with the speed of a striking hawk. The world beyond their windows vanished into a churning vortex of white. The wind shrieked like a banshee, clawing at the house, rattling the window panes, and piling snow in monstrous drifts against the doors. They were sealed in, an island in a sea of frozen chaos. For 2 days, they existed in the warm, lamplit bubble of the house, the storm a distant roar. Then, on the third morning, Lily woke with a fever. It began as a flush on her cheeks, a weariness in her eyes, but by nightfall, she was burning, her small body racked with shivers, her breaths coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced the fragile peace of the home. It was a fear Jacob knew intimately. He saw not just Lily in the bed, but his wife, her face pale against the pillow, her breath catching in the same terrible way. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm of memory and terror raging within him. He was paralyzed, the grief that had numbed him for 2 years now threatening to drown him completely. It was Anneliese who moved. Her calm, which had seemed to him a quiet resignation, was revealed as a formidable strength. She took charge, her voice steady, her hands competent. "More wood for the fire, Jacob," she commanded, her use of his name a stark command that broke through his stupor. "Boil water. We need to break this fever." They fell into a desperate rhythm, a partnership forged in the crucible of crisis. Anneliese bathed Lily's forehead with cool cloths, murmuring soft, reassuring words. Jacob kept the fire roaring, the house a bastion of heat against the deadly cold, his movements mechanical, driven by her quiet instructions. They moved around each other in the small, lamplit space, their long-held distances collapsing under the weight of their shared purpose. He saw the exhaustion lining her face but also an unwavering resolve. She saw the raw terror in his eyes, the agony of a man being forced to relive his worst nightmare. There were no more roles, no employer, no housekeeper. They were simply a man and a woman fighting for the life of a child. For hours, they fought together, a silent, desperate team, the only sounds the howling wind, the crackling fire, and the child's labored breathing. In this shared vulnerability, stripped bare by fear and exhaustion, the walls between them finally crumbled to dust. In the deepest hour of the night, when the storm raged its loudest and hope wore thin, Lily's fevered tossing stilled into a shallow, unnervingly quiet sleep. Anneliese sat by the bed, her hand resting on the child's forehead, her posture a study in weary vigilance. Jacob stood by the window, staring out into the impenetrable wall of white, feeling the ghost of the past press in on him. The silence in the room was heavier than the storm. It was a storm like this, he said, his voice a raw, broken thing he hardly recognized. He did not turn from the window. The doctor couldn't get through. I was alone with her. He didn't need to say his wife's name. Her presence filled the room. She burned just like this. I held her hand, and then she was gone. I was supposed to protect her. I failed the confession, locked away for 2 years, spilled into the quiet space between them. When she died, he continued, his voice cracking, something in me froze over. I looked at Lily, and all I could see was her mother. All I could feel was the failure. It was easier to feel nothing. To just work. It was easier than looking at my own child and seeing how badly I was letting them both down. He finally turned, his face ravaged by a grief so profound it seemed to recarve the lines around his eyes. Anneliese looked at him, her own eyes filled with a deep, sorrowful empathy. She did not offer empty platitudes. She offered him the truth. I ran away, she said, her voice barely a whisper. My husband, he was not a kind man. His hands were hard, and his words were harder. He believed a wife was a possession, something to be used and broken. The final time he raised his hand to me, I saw that if I stayed, I would end up just like my mother, a woman erased by a man's rage. So I took what little I had and I left in the night. I came here seeking not a job, but refuge. A place so quiet and empty that no one would think to look for me, or their stories, born of different pains, met in the space between them. His was a grief that had frozen him in place, hers was a fear that had propelled her across the country. Both had sought solitude as a shield. He had locked the world out, she had tried to disappear within it. In the flickering lamplight, surrounded by the shrieking wind, they saw each other for the first time not as a rancher and a housekeeper, but as two broken souls who had, by some strange twist of fate, found a shared sanctuary in the heart of a storm, with a small, feverish child as their anchor. The blizzard broke on the 5th day, the sun a weak, watery eye in a bruised-looking sky. Lily's fever had broken with it. She was pale and weak, but her breathing was even, her eyes clear. The immediate crisis had passed, leaving behind a new, altered landscape, both outside and within the walls of the house. The world was buried in snow, supplies were low, and the town felt 100 miles away. Jacob knew he had to go. He bundled Lily in layers of blankets and settled her securely in front of him on his sturdiest horse, the animal stamping and snorting clouds of steam in the frigid air. Annalise stood on the porch, her face etched with a quiet concern. "Be careful," she said, the word simple but carrying the weight of all they had endured. He just nodded, but his eyes held hers for a moment longer than necessary, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. The ride to town was arduous, a slow trek through a world of blinding white. When he finally arrived, the main street was a flurry of activity as people began to dig themselves out. His appearance, with a small, brightly wrapped child in his arms, caused a stir. Heads turned. Whispers followed him as he dismounted and walked toward the general store. He was a familiar but distant figure, and his daughter had been an object of pity and scorn. But the child he carried now was not Thorn's weed. She was clean, her hair neatly braided, her cheeks pink from the cold, not from neglect. She clung to him, a picture of a cherished child. Inside the store, the air was thick with the scent of coffee and gossip. Martha Blackwood, the town's self-appointed moral compass, watched him gather his supplies. "Well, Jacob," she said, her voice loud enough for all to hear, "I see your money was well spent. That new housekeeper of yours seems to have finally scrubbed the wildness off that child." The comment was a drop of poison in the warm air. It diminished Annalise to a transaction, Lily to a chore. The old Jacob would have ignored it, his silence a wall against the world. But the man who had weathered the storm was different. He straightened to his full height, his presence suddenly filling the store. He turned slowly and faced Mrs. Blackwood, his eyes as cold and clear as ice. Lily hid her face in his coat. "Annalise is not my housekeeper," he said, his voice low and steady, yet it cut through the room's chatter like a blade. Every eye was on him. "She is family." He left the words hanging in the stunned silence. It was a line drawn in the snow, a public declaration of a private truth. He paid for his goods, turned without another word, and walked out of the store, leaving the whispers to reform in his wake. He had not just defended Annalise's honor, he had claimed her, and the new life she represented, as his own. The journey back to the ranch was lighter, the snow-covered plain seeming to shine with promise rather than threat. When he arrived, Annalise was on the porch, watching for him, a dark, still figure against the vast white backdrop. He dismounted and lifted a sleeping Lily into her waiting arms. Their hands brushed, and a current of warmth passed between them in the cold air. That evening, the house was filled with a profound and peaceful quiet. Lily was tucked into her bed, sleeping soundly. The fire cast a warm, dancing glow on the walls. Jacob and Annalise sat at the small kitchen table, a pot of coffee between them. The space that had once been a gulf of unspoken grief was now a comfortable silence, filled with a new, shared understanding. After a long while, Jacob rose and went to a small, locked chest in the corner of the main room, a chest he hadn't opened since his wife's death. He returned to the table and placed a small, tarnished object in front of Annalise. It was a silver ring, simple and unadorned, worn smooth with time. It was his wife's wedding band. Anneliese looked at it, then up at him, her eyes questioning. It was hers, he said, his voice thick with emotion. He wasn't a man for pretty speeches or flowery words. His heart was a language of actions, of fences mended and storms weathered. He pushed the ring gently across the wooden table toward her. The past is a ghost. It will always be here. But it doesn't have to haunt the whole house. He met her gaze, his own eyes clear and certain. Anneliese, this house needs a heart. Lily needs a mother. And I? He faltered, the words new and difficult on his tongue. I need a wife. Not to replace what was, but to build what can be. The offer was stark, simple, and utterly sincere. He was not offering her a position, he was offering her a life, a partnership. He was offering her his broken, healing heart. Anneliese looked at the ring, its silver surface reflecting the warm firelight. She thought of the cold, hard man she had first met, and the terrified father she had seen in the storm. She thought of the little girl who had asked if she was staying. She looked at Jacob's hands on the table, calloused and strong, the hands of a man who could build and protect. Slowly, she reached out and her fingers closed around the ring. She did not speak. She simply slid the worn silver band onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. With Anneliese's quiet acceptance, the last of the winter in Jacob Thorne's soul began to thaw. The coming of spring to the high plains that year felt like a miracle, a promise kept. The snow receded, revealing the sleeping earth, and the first green shoots pushed their way toward the sun. The ranch, once a place of stark survival, began to breathe with a new, gentle life. The change was in the small, everyday moments. It was in the sight of bright curtains, sewn by Anneliese from a bolt of calico, fluttering in the windows. It was in the sound of Lily's laughter as Jacob, with a patience he never knew he possessed, taught her to ride a small, steady pony. It was in the garden Anneliese planted near the porch, her hands turning the dark soil, coaxing life from the ground in the form of beans and squash and vibrant, cheerful sunflowers that turned their faces to the east each morning. Jacob found himself smiling, a slow, unaccustomed stretching of muscles long dormant. He would watch Anneliese as she worked, her movements filled with a graceful purpose, and feel a sense of peace so profound it settled deep in his bones. The silence between them was no longer a void but a shared language. They could spend an entire evening on the porch, he cleaning a harness, she shelling peas, without a single word passing between them, yet feeling more connected than he ever had with the easy chatter of the past. He learned the landscape of her moods through the smallest gestures, the slight tightening of her lips when she was worried, the soft hum that meant she was content. She, in turn, learned to read his stillness, to know when his silence was thoughtful and when it was troubled. They were two solitary trees who had learned to grow together, their roots intertwining beneath the surface, drawing strength from the same soil. One afternoon, he came upon her and Lily in the new garden. Lily was carefully watering a row of seedlings, her small face a mask of concentration. Anneliese was weeding nearby, a stray strand of hair falling across her face. She looked up as he approached and brushed it away with the back of a dirt-smeared hand, leaving a smudge on her cheek. She smiled at him, a genuine, unguarded smile that lit up her grey eyes. In that simple, domestic moment, the warm sun, the smell of the earth, the sight of his daughter thriving and the woman he loved smiling at him, Jacob felt the last of the ice around his heart crack and melt away, leaving not a scar, but fertile ground for a new life to grow. The years that followed did not erase the sorrows of the past, but they softened their edges, like river stones worn smooth by the steady current of time. The Thorne Ranch became known not as a place of tragedy, but as a place of quiet strength and warmth. The sunflowers in Anneliese's garden grew tall and strong, a golden beacon visible from the road. The house, once a cold shell, was filled with the scents of baking, the sounds of laughter, and the steady, beating heart of a family forged in a crucible. Jacob never became a man of many words, but his actions spoke a clear and constant poetry of love. It was in the sturdy new swing he built for Lily, hanging it from the branches of the oldest cartonwood tree. It was in the small, carved bird he left on Anneliese's pillow one morning, a gift for no reason other than to see her smile. It was in the way he would reach for her hand as they sat on the porch in the evenings, their fingers lacing together in a gesture of easy, certain belonging. Lily grew from a timid weed into a bright, confident flower, her roots sunk deep in the certainty of being loved. The shunned, silent child was gone, replaced by a girl with her father's resilience and her mother's gentle spirit. The past remained a part of their story, a somber chapter that gave depth and meaning to the peace they now enjoyed. Sometimes, on a winter's night when the wind howled with the voice of the storm, Jacob would look across the warm room at Annalise and Lily, their heads bent together over a book, and he would feel a surge of gratitude so fierce it was almost painful. He had paid for a housekeeper to bring order to his home, but fate had sent him a woman who brought grace to his soul. He had sought to wash his child clean of neglect, and in doing so, had his own frozen heart cleansed by a love he never expected to feel again. He had learned that a home is not just a structure of wood and stone, but a shelter built from shared vulnerability and forgiveness. It is a quiet place where broken things can be mended, where silent sorrows can be heard, and where three solitary figures, sketched in chalk on a piece of slate, can become a family, holding hands forever beneath a warm and hopeful sun.